The sunlight was soft that morning, sliding through the pale curtains of the small countryside house where Tu Diep had just returned after weeks in the hospital. The scent of warm rice porridge drifted from the kitchen, mixed with the faint perfume of blooming jasmine outside the window. Life was slowly returning to her, gentle, quiet, and fragile. Tu Diep sat by the wooden table near the window, her skin still pale but her eyes bright again. Every sound outside, the chirping birds, the children laughing on their way to school, felt like a gift she had almost lost. James had gone to take little Nee to school, leaving her in the care of his mother, Mrs. Hyen, who treated her like her own daughter. "Eat this, dear. You need strength." "Mrs. Hyen said softly, setting a bowl of minced pork porridge before her. Tu Diep smiled, her voice a whisper. "Thank you, Auntie. I'll get better soon, I promise." "You always say that," the older woman chuckled, brushing a loose strand of hair from Diep's face. "Just rest. Work can wait. James is handling everything." But Tu Diep couldn't help worrying. Her thoughts kept returning to the unfinished farm, the one she and James had poured their dreams into. She wondered if the workers were doing all right, if the construction was on schedule. She hated being weak, lying here while others worked. Outside, a motorbike engine stopped at the gate. Mrs. Hyen looked up from the stove, frowning slightly. Who could that be? Tu Diep froze when she heard the voice. Deep, steady, unmistakable. "Good morning, Auntie. Is Tu Diep home?" It was John, the man who once stood against James in business, whose coldness had nearly destroyed everything they built. Yet now, he stood at their door with a bouquet of pale chrysanthemums in his hand. A strange choice, somewhere between apology and remembrance. Mrs. Hyen hesitated for a moment but finally nodded. "She's inside, but she's still weak, John." "I won't stay long," he said quietly. "I just wanted to see how she's doing, to say thank you." When John stepped inside, Tu Diep looked up from her chair. Her eyes widened. She hadn't expected to see him. Not here, not now. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence carried the weight of everything that had happened. The betrayal, the near disaster, the pain James had gone through because of him. John cleared his throat, his voice rougher than usual. "You look better than I expected. I heard you were very sick." Tu Diep managed a faint smile. "I'm recovering, thank you. It's been a difficult time." He nodded, setting the flowers on the table. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything that happened, and thank you for not turning away when things fell apart." Her eyes softened for a moment. "People make mistakes, John. What matters is what they do afterward." He smiled faintly, a shadow of guilt passing over his face. "You're kinder than I deserve." At that moment, the sound of a car door closing echoed from outside. Footsteps quick, firm, familiar. James had returned. He stepped into the house, his expression bright with relief at first, until his eyes fell on John. The air changed instantly, like a storm gathering behind calm clouds. "John?" James's voice was low but sharp. "What are you doing here?" John turned toward him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I came to see Tu Diep, nothing more." "After everything you did?" James's hands clenched unconsciously. "You think you can just walk in here with flowers and—" "James." Tu Diep's soft voice cut through the rising tension. "Please. It's okay. He just came to visit." James looked at her, her face still pale, her hands trembling slightly on the edge of the table, and the anger in his chest faltered. He drew a deep breath, forcing his voice to steady. "You shouldn't be here, John. Not now." John nodded slowly, understanding. "I know. I'll leave." He turned to Tu Diep once more, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take care of yourself, Diep. And thank you." As he walked out the door, the faint scent of chrysanthemums lingered in the air. James stood silently for a long moment, watching John's figure fade beyond the gate. His thoughts swirled between anger and confusion. Was that man's visit truly out of gratitude, or was there something else behind those eyes? Tu Diep reached out, placing her hand gently over his. "James, don't let it trouble you," she murmured. Maybe some wounds need a second chance to heal. James looked at her, fragile yet strong, the woman he had sworn to protect for the rest of his life, and felt his heart soften. But deep inside, he knew, this wasn't the end of John's story. It was only the beginning of another storm. That evening, the wind blew softly through the fields behind the house. The sound of crickets filled the air, blending with the rhythmic hum of night. James sat alone on the porch, his mind restless. The image of John standing in their living room earlier that day wouldn't leave him. Something in John's eyes, the quiet calm, the too measured tone, didn't feel right. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, quieter, and far more dangerous. Inside, Tu Diep was resting. She had fallen asleep after taking her medicine, her breathing soft and even. Mrs. Huyen had gone to her room, leaving James alone under the pale moonlight. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through recent messages from the construction site. Everything looked fine on paper, but his instincts told him otherwise. Just as he was about to call the site supervisor, his phone buzzed. It was Lin, the man overseeing the farm project. "Boss, there's something you might want to know," Lin said cautiously. "A few hours ago, someone came by the site asking questions about the new storage building. Said he used to work with you." James frowned. "What was his name?" "John. He said he was a partner." The name made James's heart drop. He tightened his grip on the phone. "What did he want?" "He just asked about materials, costs, who's financing the build." Then he left. Didn't cause trouble, but he seemed curious, like he was checking something. James exhaled slowly. So that was it. John hadn't just come to visit Tu Diep. He had another motive, something tied to the new farm, their biggest project yet. When he returned to the bedroom, the sight of Tu Diep asleep softened his thoughts. Her hand rested lightly on the blanket, her hair spilling over the pillow like a whisper of black silk. For a moment, all the business, all the suspicion faded. He sat quietly beside her, brushing a finger along her cheek. "Sleep well, Diep," he murmured. "I'll take care of everything." The next morning came with sunlight spilling through the window, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. Tu Diep woke to the sound of James talking on the phone. His tone was calm, but edged with tension. "Yes, double-check the financial transfers. I want every purchase recorded. If there's any leak of information, I need to know who's behind it."
She sat up slowly, watching him. His expression was serious, colder than usual. The look of a man balancing love and war. When he noticed her awake, his tone softened instantly. "Good morning," he said, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she replied quietly. "But you're worried about something, aren't you?" James hesitated, then walked closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. "John showed up at the site last night. I don't know what he's planning, but I don't trust him." Tu Diep looked down at her hands. "Maybe he really just wanted to see how we're doing." James gave a small, sad laugh. "Men like John don't visit for comfort. They visit for control." She reached out and took his hand. "Whatever he's trying to do, we'll face it together. You've protected me enough, James. Let me stand with you this time." Her words were simple, but they sank deep into his heart. For the first time in days, the tightness in his chest eased. He nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "All right," he whispered. "Together." Later that day, while James went to inspect the farm site, Tu Diep stayed behind with Mrs. Huyen and little Nee. The laughter of the child filled the small garden, light and innocent, washing away the tension that had lingered since morning. But even as she smiled, Tu Diep couldn't shake off the feeling that something was shifting, quietly like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm. By evening, James returned home later than usual. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. Dirt smeared faintly on his hands. But it wasn't fatigue that darkened his face. It was what he had discovered. When Tu Diep handed him a glass of water, he finally spoke. "You were right," he said quietly. "The workers told me John offered them higher pay to move to another project. He's trying to disrupt the schedule, maybe even steal the team." Tu Diep's heart tightened. "But why? Didn't he say he was sorry?" James's voice dropped. "Maybe his apology was just another move. Maybe he's not done with us yet." Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. the sign of a coming storm. James looked toward the window, his reflection caught in the glass. If John thinks he can play this game again, he murmured, then he's forgotten who he's dealing with. Behind him, Tu Diep whispered softly, almost to herself, and yet, sometimes, the people who hurt us most are the ones who need saving. He turned to her, confused, but she only smiled faintly, as if she knew something he didn't. The storm outside had only just begun, and so had the one within their hearts. The rain started in slow whispers against the roof, soft at first, then heavier until it filled the night with its restless rhythm. James stood under the dim light of the porch, phone pressed to his ear, his voice steady but cold. "John, we need to talk," he said. On the other end, silence, then a quiet laugh. "I was wondering when you'd call, James. Still trying to protect everything you built?" "This isn't about business anymore," James replied. "It's about honesty. Why are you really here?" Tu Diep, who had stepped quietly into the hallway, froze when she heard John's name. The door was slightly open, and through the rain she could hear their voices, one calm, one burning with tension. John's tone dropped. "You really don't know, do you? Your father, he took my family's land years ago. The land your company was built on. Everything you own stands on what was once mine." James went still. "That's not possible. My father would never." "He would. And he did," John cut him off, his voice sharp as thunder. "You were too young to remember, but my family lost everything while yours thrived. You think I wanted revenge? No. I wanted justice." Tu Diep's breath caught in her throat. The truth hit her like a wave. This wasn't just rivalry or pride. It was old pain, inherited from another generation. James's hand trembled slightly. "You could have talked to me." "I tried," John said softly. "But you were your father's son, and now you'll learn what it means to lose." The call ended. The sound of the rain grew louder, swallowing the silence that followed. Tu Diep stepped into the porch, her eyes shining with tears. "James," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What will you do now?" He turned toward her, his face pale but resolute. "What I should have done from the beginning," he said quietly. "End this. Not with hatred, but with truth." The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a silver mist that clung to the trees and rooftops. Tu Diep stood by the window, her eyes distant as she watched droplets slide down the glass. The storm outside had passed, but the one within her heart was still raging. James entered quietly, holding 2 cups of warm tea. He set one beside her and said softly, "I couldn't sleep last night." "Neither could I," she admitted, her voice fragile. "Everything we believed in, it's all connected to something much darker." James nodded, his gaze heavy with guilt. "My father's mistakes shouldn't define who I am. But now I understand why John couldn't forgive us. He lost everything because of what my family did." Tu Diep turned to him, her eyes full of compassion. "Then maybe it's time to stop the cycle of hate, James. You can't change the past, but you can choose what comes next." Her words lingered in the air, soft yet powerful. James reached for her hand, his grip warm and certain. "You've always seen light in the darkest places," he said with a faint smile. "Maybe that's why I need you." Just then a knock echoed at the door. When James opened it, John stood there, raincoat still damp, eyes weary but calmer. "I didn't come for revenge anymore," John said quietly. "I came to end this." The 3 of them sat together in the quiet room. No accusations, no bitterness, only truth. James looked at John, then at Tu Diep. "Our father's war ends here," he said. "We start again, with honesty." John nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "Then maybe we can all breathe again." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the horizon in gold. Tu Diep smiled faintly. For the first time in a long while, peace didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a beginning. The story of James, Tu Diep, and John reminds us that the weight of the past can destroy the peace of the present, unless we choose forgiveness over revenge. Sometimes the pain we carry doesn't belong to us alone. It comes from generations before us, but we have the power to stop it, to end the cycle of hate and start anew. James learned that true strength is not found in pride or power, but in the courage to face the truth and make things right. Tu Diep taught that love can heal even the deepest wounds when it is rooted in understanding and compassion. And John, through his pain, realized that justice without forgiveness only breeds more sorrow. The greatest lesson of all is that healing begins when we listen, not to justify, not to fight, but to understand. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it frees the heart to build a better future. In the end, peace is not something we find, it's something we create, together with honesty, empathy, and love.